Just this year, we had 69,000 unaccompanied children come into the United States. The conditions are still the same on the ground in Central America, and what I saw were children telling me, the narcos and the gangs who often work with them control my neighborhood, they control my high school, they control my elementary school, they are forcing children coming out of elementary school to use crack, to get hooked on crack, to work for the cartels. The cartels are trying to grow, the gangs are trying to grow in these countries, and they're recruiting children to be their foot soldiers, and those conditions have not improved. And as long as those conditions are the same, where you have children telling me, I have been threatened once, twice, 3 times, they're telling me that if I either join with them or I'm going to get killed and my whole family is going to get killed. And as long as that continues to happen, those push factors are the same. And the pull factors may vary somewhat, but those push factors are so overridingly what are driving this exodus from these, especially Salvador and Honduras. I think with Guatemala there's more economic factors with, there's been some crop failures, there's been coffee rust, there's been other issues that work more in Guatemala than in the other 2 Northern Triangle countries, but those push factors are not getting better. So
many of them are coming for educational opportunities as well, because the school system is rather lackluster in a lot of their home countries. So I believe it's in El Salvador that students are only required to attend school for half a day in many of the schools there, and the students don't feel that that is adequate for them. A lot of times too, because of droughts or weather conditions, the schools will just close, and the students miss weeks or months of school. And so they are seeking better educational opportunities in the United States.
You can look at trade policies like NAFTA. Under NAFTA we had all this corn that you and I subsidize as taxpayers that is very cheap and mechanized here in the United States, flood into the Mexican market, and the price of corn declined by 66% overnight, and 1 million corn farmers, per labor economists, could not compete with this stuff from the north, and they migrated to, 1 million people migrated to the United States. So yes, many of our policies historically, both in terms of helping to generate wars in Central America, our trade policies, our consumption of drugs in the United States.
Other reasons involve economic, or the lack of economic opportunities. So a lot of them talk about their families being very poor, not being able to afford books for school or food for their, for their own nourishment. And so they see the United States as a place where they can find work and make money and actually be able to support themselves, because they don't have that kind of support system in their home countries. Also, many of the unaccompanied minors are coming to the United States to join relatives who are already living here. So their relatives usually come for the same reasons: economic opportunities, avoiding violence, trying to find better educational opportunities. So sometimes the unaccompanied minors, in addition to wanting to avoid violence and wanting to find educational opportunities, they come to live with the family members who have left them behind. So a lot of the children in our center are coming to meet up with their father in Virginia or their mother in San Francisco. They have family members who they're very close to who have left them behind, and they're trying to meet up with them. Some of the children also have never met their parents. Their mother maybe left when they were 2 years old, or their father left when they were 3, and they don't remember their parents very much. So they want to meet their parents and have a relationship with them.
Castles and Miller's economic and historical structural theories can be applied to this current wave of unaccompanied minors entering the U.S. First, the economic and push-pull factors are very evident here in the push to escape drug-related violence and in the pull to maximize their well-being via educational opportunities in the United States. Second, when Sonia mentioned the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is a government trade policy that has had major effects on the agricultural economy, we see the application of the historical structural approach because of the mass recruitment of cheap labor that took place immediately after the price of corn fell by 66%. Lastly, when Laura mentioned the many unaccompanied minors who come to the U.S. to reunite with family members who left them behind, we can apply the globalization of motherhood theory, which is the desegregation of the biologic and caregiving components of motherhood. There is clearly a care deficit of these children whose mothers and fathers have migrated to the U.S.
A foot guide is a young child or teenage child, typically Mexican, who works for an organization or some sort of boss who tells this teenage kid to help cross immigrants from Central America over to the United States. So basically, let's take the example of a kid named Manuel. If Manuel is 17 years old, from Mexico, in need of a job, and is pretty good with directions, he can work with a boss who will assign him different clients, and these clients are typically immigrants from maybe El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Manuel, the 17-year-old child, will help the clients from these Central American countries cross the border into the United States using different pathways that Manuel has been taught. So the idea is that these foot guides are experts in crossing the border, and they are paid to take Central American immigrants across the border safely.
Just a little background on how the process works. So when children come in, they're oftentimes turning themselves into Border Patrol. At that point, they're taken into federal custody. They're issued a charging document that places them in removal proceedings.
But a lot of the foot guides are captured at the border, and although they were not intending themselves to stay in the United States, they are apprehended by the immigration services of the United States and sent to federal detention centers, the same as any Central American student or child would be crossing the border illegally.
Foot guides who are hired to take people across the border via the pathways they have learned are an example of the migration industry that has been formed because of mass migration. The migration industry consists of helpers and exploiters of migrants and have a strong interest in the continuation of migration. These foot guides are part of the mesostructures that have taken on a role with immigrants in the political and economic institutions that involve them.
We are essentially now just treating them as criminals. Regardless of their age, they are locked up in facilities that are not that different from prisons.
I work at Heartland Alliance, which is an organization that provides services to all different kinds of people in the United States and also in the rest of the world. So I specifically work for a program within Heartland Alliance called the International Children's Reception Center, and it's a location that provides housing, basically residency, for immigrant children who have crossed the border illegally. So these children are unaccompanied minors. They're technically called by the government UACs, which stands for Unaccompanied Alien Children. And I mean, we don't prefer to use that term, but that is legally what they are classified as. And these children are brought to our center from detention centers in Texas. And at the center that we run here in Chicago, we provide housing, food, clothing, and educational services, as well as medical services to the kids. So the kids are in our center, basically being held in federal detention, but they're awaiting release from our center. So that means that we're holding them until they can find a person who can sponsor them in the United States, and they can use that sponsor to gain citizenship. We operate at a building that is 4 stories tall, and 3 of the stories were comprised of all boys, and 1 of the stories was comprised of all girls. Now that the numbers of immigrant children crossing the border have kind of dwindled, we have 1 floor of boys and 1 floor of girls, so it's pretty much equal. but I would say the trend is definitely far more boys than girls crossing the border. The attitudes that a foot guide has versus the attitude of a child who actually is trying to cross over the border and stay in the United States is wildly different. You know, those who are trying to stay in the United States see the federal detention center that we're running in Chicago as a step on the way to becoming a U.S. citizen, which is their main goal, whereas a foot guide sees the federal detention center that we're running as jail, and they want to leave, and they have very negative attitudes. We've seen animosity recently between Mexican participants, mostly foot guides, and Central American students. We've heard a lot of just children yelling, "Mexico, go Mexico," or other ones saying, "Oh, El Salvador is the best." But again, putting them in projects together, having them in classes together, playing sports together, a lot of that tension has kind of been diffused.
Laura discusses that in her center, she has seen more boy than girl migrants. As we learned in reading Lim, gender relations often determine the reasons and motivations for migration. Government laws and regulations controlling international migrations are not gender neutral. For example, a woman's entry status determines her right to set up legal residence, her right to naturalization, her right to a work permit, and relative access to public assistance. We learned that women's position is relative to men over the course of a lifetime within a particular socioeconomic, cultural, and political legal context. Therefore, we can conclude that children's position is relative to adults, leaving young girls the most vulnerable and least likely to migrate.
When they're in the facilities, most of them are in these Office of Refugee Resettlement facilities for around 30 days, sometimes more.
The majority of the children at our center are reunited with family members in the United States or with family friends in the United States. So I would say that a great percentage end up living with their cousin, with their uncle, with their mother, their father, their grandfather, or a sibling, or like I said, a family friend. It's very rare that a participant or a child will have to live with a foster family because it's a long process to go through foster care, especially as an undocumented immigrant child, and it's very rare that a child would cross over the border without having some sort of family member already in the United States. It would take a lot of very extreme circumstances for a child to cross the border without any plan of where to go. But really, some of the cases where a child has to live in foster care are not due to the fact that they didn't have a plan. It's due to the fact that specialists at our center have deemed their family in the United States' circumstances as unsafe. So every child has to provide the information to our center of the people that they hope to live with, and then our center investigates these family members or family friends and determines whether or not the family members have a safe living environment for the participants or for the children. So if there seems to be an abusive environment in the home of the family member here in the United States of the child, then an in-person investigation will have to happen. And if the investigation turns up evidence of real abuse, then the child cannot be sent to that family member's home. Also, if there seems to be not enough space for the child in the home, say the home has 2 bedrooms and 8 people, that's not a safe environment. If the family member doesn't seem to be cooperative with the legal process that has to continue when the child is released from our program, then that would be another reason that the child would not be able to be released to that family member. So when the children are released from our center, this does not mean that they suddenly gain citizenship. It means that they are required to continue attending court dates. They have to keep going to court to have a court determine whether or not they should gain citizenship or be returned to their home countries.
As we heard Laura mention, most of the kids are reunited with family or family friends. In fact, 90% of all UACs are reunited. To use Castle and Miller's term, they migrate with social capital. The family members and family friends form an informal social network that is essential for the kids to be released from federal detention. Having a social network as an adult is important, but even more so for a child, let alone migrating alone. To me, the most important thing that the network provides is emotional support for these kids who have just been through quite a traumatic experience. Out of the 3 migration systems that Castles and Miller describe, guest worker, colonial worker, and classical, the idea that the U.S. government allows these kids to be with their family or family friends while they continue their deportation proceedings is an idea that gives support to the view that the U.S. is indeed a classical migration system.
So they're in deportation proceedings until they either prevail in their cases and win some form of relief, which might be asylum, it might be a special immigrant juvenile visa, it might be some other form of protection that they can tap into.
Also, our immigration system doesn't really differentiate children from adults. The elements of an asylum claim are exactly the same for a 12-year-old boy as they are for a 35-year-old woman. She has to prove persecution on account of race, religion, political opinion. Very, very difficult for kids. They don't come with a suitcase full of evidence and information to prove their case.
70 to 90% of kids go to court with no representation, and perhaps half of them would be entitled to some relief to stay here legally. But as I said at lunch, very few of them are getting that relief because they don't have an advocate by their side. So I've had kind staff describe five-year-olds, clutching teddy bears in court before a judge with no lawyer to help them because they're terrified that anything they can say to this judge could send them hurtling back to these dangerous, circumstances in their home countries that they fled. The president of KIND has seen babies who were abandoned by smugglers brought into court in a federal agent's arms with no attorney for that baby. So that baby is being asked to make their case in court before this rogue judge. So it really is the difference between winning and not winning, is having legal representation.
The average length of time that a child is in deportation proceedings is 516 days, which means we won't know for quite a while if the majority of kids will be granted citizenship, or if they will be deported back to their home countries. We don't yet know if the U.S. does indeed favor family reunification and permanent settlement, which are elements of classical migration systems.
You win your asylum claim, right? And then they go, wherever they go, there's no services, there's no treatment. What happens to them? And we don't really know.
I was just in Austin, Texas. There's an international high school there, 70% Honduran recent arrivals. So Houston, Austin, New York, LA, you see they're called newcomer schools, which are for recent arrivals. These are areas that have a lot of immigrants always coming, and from Central America and Mexico, and you see high schools that are tapped out. Oakland, San Francisco have just designated point people in the school system to deal with this surge of children coming into the school systems.
The English levels of the participants vary pretty widely. I would say we have some who speak English pretty well. They've gone to school for several years and have studied English in school, whereas others, they don't speak English at all, and they barely speak Spanish too. We've had some participants, some children in our program who have not spoken even Spanish, which is the national language, the official language of their home country. So this has been a bit of a challenge for some of them because most of our program is designed for children who speak Spanish. And so there are very few staff members who speak indigenous languages from Guatemala or El Salvador or Honduras. So those participants struggle. A lot of them are also illiterate. We like to call that low literacy. So they're unable to form sentences, to form words, to identify letters. Some of them we've had to teach how to hold a pencil. That's in very extreme cases. But for the most part, really you can't say whether there's more kids who speak English or more kids who don't. We get a big mix of children from all different backgrounds. So there are some who speak a lot of English. A lot of it sounds like it's from movies, but it could also be from the education that they've had. We have had a couple of children actually, who lived in Texas. They grew up, maybe their parents crossed them over from Central America or Mexico when they were 2 years old. They were brought to the country illegally as a 2-year-old, lived maybe for 14 years in Texas, learning English in a public school in Texas, and then they crossed back into Mexico or into Central America just to visit family. And when they tried to cross back into the United States, they were apprehended at the border by immigration. So we have some children who speak English fluently and better than they speak Spanish because they lived a great portion of their life in the United States.
We discussed double, threefold, and fourfold discrimination of women based on gender, being a foreigner, race, and socioeconomic position. These children have the additional discrimination of being a child because children have no agency. When Laura mentioned the varying degrees of English speaking skills among the children, this indicates that certain children will experience more discrimination than others. Overall, the U.S. takes a laissez-faire approach within Castle and Miller's multicultural model because cultural difference is accepted but not supported by the state.
But I think we have had a huge role in the problems in some of these countries, and therefore bear some of the responsibility for trying to fix it. If nothing else, if we want to reduce this flow that has been historic over the last 20 years, reduce it permanently as opposed to stop screaming at each other from opposite sides of the political divide, we need to start dealing with the root causes of what's driving this migration. We need to start working to try to change conditions in these 4 countries that send 3/4 of the folks who come here unlawfully.
Varias primaveras atrás el viento cambió y una canción